Good morning, Madison Hills. Feeling good? No? Or did I rush that question? Yeah, okay. All right. We're good. Last night was phenomenal. If you missed it, I think we're going to make it annual, or at least ask Tommy and Connie if we can make it annual at their place. But it was a phenomenal time. I think about 55% of our church showed up. It was a phenomenal experience. I know there was a ball game and competing things, so I'm not guilting you for not being there. But if you were there, you know it was a great time. Wonderful sense of fellowship and community. Loved it. Also, side note, we have several people popping up in ministry leader positions around here and stepping up and serving and taking ownership of various areas. So I got bombarded with several of those last week. So there's two caveats to this. One is thank you for being who you are. When I had the clipboard, when I left after the sermon last week, I was standing in the back. Within a minute and a half, that bad boy was full. It was amazing how many people were like, yep, put my name down. I'm on it. I'll take care of that. I'm on the rotation. Phenomenal. So Madison Hills, from the pastor's perspective, thank you for having a servant's heart. Number two, I had several people saying, okay, now my stuff goes on the clipboard next week. Yeah. So, I may be bringing that up every now and then just to get us rolling. So we're finishing up with our series, The Church Defined, kicking off a new series next week we're going to dip into the Old Testament based on 1st and 2nd Samuel. It's centered around the life of David. It'll be a really fun study for us. But finishing up The Church Defined, and I think it's been phenomenal to connect with you. And you've shared stories with me, and we've had some good conversations about what the idea, the concept, or God's vision of church, what it means, and how that is applicable to your life in real time. So it's been phenomenal to see the growth generated through this series. So super cool stuff going on. Now we're going to finish up with the idea of prayer. I don't know about you, but a confession here. Prayer for me has always been a struggle. When I first got into church and I was listening to people pray, I noticed that there were some people who just had the right words all the stinking time. And then some people would go on and on and on. And then some prayers were quick. And then some people always wanted you to stand. Some people always said, nope, you've got to be on your knees, burning holes in the jeans. You've got to be on your knees. And prayer's been complicated. And over the years, I found myself in certain situations really struggling with the idea of prayer. And what do I say? And how long do I pray? And can I really pray in public? Am I there yet? You ever felt like that? There's no way I could pray in front of people. But yet this prayer is something tangible that we should do to connect with our God and sometimes each other. So as we finish up, just a quick story. Mr. Gaddy's is what I call it, but maybe you know it as Gaddy Town. You ever been to Gaddy Town with children, grandchildren, school trip or something like that? We used to go a lot. We lived in Harlan and Gaddy Town was in Corbin, so we'd just zip over to Corbin and we'd go to Gaddy Town, spend several hours there. Fantastic family outing. And we would go, and Christian and Sophie were always really good at these games, winning all those tickets, and they loved to go in that little area where you redeem the tickets for the prizes and all that stuff. So we're in there having a time of our lives, and we come out, and we go to our car, and I realize, walking over there, oh gosh, you're kidding me, because I'm doing this, always check for my keys. They're not there, and it's at the time we have a car where it doesn't have the clicker on it, so you got to do that thing right there, and I'm like, oh, I left them in there. I know, I hope they're in Gaddy Town. I walk over closer to the car. There the keys are. They're right there in the ignition, and it's locked. And I'm like, oh, come on. We're tired. We're zapped. It's been a long day. It's hot out here. The kids are small. And I start going through this scenario, and I do what I assume all of you would do. I pray. You ever been in a situation like that and you're praying and it's like 50-50? This is kind of nonsensical to be praying about this, but at the same time it's like, well, who knows? So I'm praying about this and I'm a little just distraught about it. It's just one of those things, and I'm praying about it, and here's my literal thought. I can see that lock on this car. It was a Dodge Magnum. I can see it right now. So I'm like, God, if you can part the Red Sea, then you can, just pop that thing up and let me in. And this is about 15 years ago, and I remember struggling with that, thinking, why not? Like, it's so insignificant. and you designed everything. Why not? And being a pastor for as long as I have, I've been involved in the lives of people, and they let me in behind the scenes. And I think that's a recurring question for some of us when it comes to prayer. You pray and you ask God, and you vocalize these words, and you send them north, and nothing happens. And isn't the human response, I mean, why not? Why not just answer this? Why not just make this happen? Well, if you remember, we're walking through Acts 2:42 as kind of defining this church, and it says that those dripping wet disciples who were freshly baptized, they devoted themselves to the idea of the apostles' teaching and to the fellowship, to the breaking of bread, and to prayer. And if you'll remember at the start of the series, we launched the wording of that idea of devotion that means you are devoted to this. You are devoted to this direction despite difficulty. So when I think about prayer and unanswered prayers, and I'm sure you're very familiar with, just as I am, what happens in those moments? I mean, if I'm going to pray, God wants me to be devoted to prayer, and I'm going to pray, and He's not going to answer every single time, then what's the point? And why, over time, am I going to become blunted to this? Why would I bring some stuff to Him if I just have it sorted out in my mind that, well, it's probably not going to be answered anyway? So why is there a devotion to prayer? So there's a story in the Old Testament, and we're just going to look at the first two chapters because I want to save it for later in the new year. And it comes from the Old Testament, Nehemiah. And Nehemiah was a guy who had his world rocked, and it was a lot more severe than keys locked in the car. He had his world rocked. His hometown was leveled. And he gets word about this. He's living in another city right now. And he gets word that his hometown's been leveled. Just the wall around the city has been knocked down. And it's been laying there for close to 100, 150 years, and no one's doing anything about it. And he gets word about the despair and the hopelessness going on in this, and it just bothers him. And his job, he's a cupbearer to the king. So he's kind of a wine taster kind of deal for this king, and he's going to have a lot of influence with this guy, build up some trust. But suffice it now to say, he's just having his world rocked, learning about what's going on. But the way he engages prayer, if you and I pay attention to this story, I think he puts on a clinic when it comes to prayer. There's some things that go on in the life of Nehemiah that say, wow, maybe David Green has a very low view of prayer. And these are some of the thoughts that I need to consider when I'm bringing stuff to this beautiful God that I serve. So when you start out in Nehemiah, you read the first few verses and you see he gets his world rocked, gets this news that his hometown is leveled. And for some days, notice this language, this is like the immediate context. For some days, he hears about this. Notice that language, I heard, and I sat down, and I mourned, I fasted, and I prayed. And notice that little adjustment there. I mourned, I fasted, I prayed. Then I said, well, I thought the prayer was the saying. No, for some days, I'm sorting through some stuff in mourning, questioning, confusion. What's going on? Why not? I'm fasting. And if you know anything about Old Testament fasting, it's a way to connect with God, maybe to get Him to move. So I'm doing all the right things. And maybe for you and I, I'm reading the Bible. I'm showing up at Madison Hills 3 out of 4 Sundays. Okay, good. You're paying attention. I'm showing up there. I'm praying, and nothing's changing. Or maybe the things that should be changing are, and the things that shouldn't be changing, well, they're not. So then he says, now, I never want to trick you, okay? I never want to trick you. But you know, we talk a lot about context when we're studying the Bible. I'm never, ever going to set you up for failure or anything like that. So no show of hands or anything. But I want to know if you connect with this verse. And you can tell me later, but this comes from 1 John chapter 5. And notice the language, because when we put stuff on graduate gifts or home interior pictures or little things we'll put on the dash of our car or store in our wallet or purse, we usually don't do the whole story or the whole chapter. We'll do it by a verse, right? You give graduates, I know the plans I have for you, says, declares the Lord, right? So do you agree with this verse? And you don't have to raise your hand or anything like that. But notice the positivity. 1 John 5:15. Whatever we ask, we know that he hears us. So we have whatever we ask him for. And I read that and I'm thinking, yeah, I asked him to just do this. And it didn't happen. And you've asked him for some stuff too. And you've talked to him. And it didn't happen. So what does this mean? And I think this verse in context gives us a little insight into what's going on with Nehemiah, who for some days wrestled with this stuff. For some days he had questions. For some days he tried this and he tried this. And he's praying and he's sorting it out. And it reached a moment to where maybe he gets clear about something. So then he can step in and say this to his God. But notice what the very first part of this verse says. This is our confidence in approaching God. Not that whatever we ask for, we have it. No, our confidence in approaching God is this. If we ask anything according to his will, then he hears us. And we can take great confidence in the fact that we're beginning to pray according to his will. So whatever it is we're praying, if it's according to his will, then we have that. And I think it's for some days with Nehemiah that he begins to pick up on this and realize that maybe the first experience of having his world rocked and then wanting to react to that and say, God, you got to move and you got to do something about this. Well, that wasn't the will of God. And as this story unfolds, as we're going to see, what's really interesting is that this problem that Nehemiah wrestles with and brings to his God, God actually taps Nehemiah on the shoulder and says, I'm going to use you to become part of the solution for this thing that's bothering you. Now, I don't know about you, but when you first have some trouble come your way, that's not the first immediate reaction, is it? Oh, I'll help take care of this. No, God, do something about it, especially if it's significant and emotional and something that really wrecks us to the point of hearing it and sitting down and mourning and fasting and praying. So then I said, so Nehemiah, notice what he says next, and you can read this in the first chapter. I've kind of categorized it here for us because it's a lengthy chapter and it's a little deep, but I want you to not deep and like hard to understand, but there's depth to it and there's breadth to it. But notice how his prayers go. He confesses, and that's the very first thing he does when he starts talking to his God after he sorts some of this out. He steps into this prayer and he says, God, you know what? I think I'm getting it now. We Israelites have been part of the problem, myself and my family included. We've sinned against you. Your ways haven't been our ways. The things you wanted us to do, we didn't do them. And that's part of the reason we're here now. Isn't that amazing? So the very first step in this prayer for Nehemiah, once he gets clear in his mind and stops reacting and starts responding, is, God, I want to make sure that I'm not just asking you for stuff, but I'm approaching you based on your ways and your will. It's that 1 John dynamic. I want to have confidence in this prayer. So I want to make sure that I'm approaching this at the angle from your will, your ways. And then he moves on and he starts to internalize some stuff. And I don't know about you, but it's easy for David Green to become really familiar with certain parts of Scripture. And certain parts of the Bible I read and I reread because they make sense or they click or I was exposed to them at a pivotal point in my life and they've become life verse status for me. And I love to hear them and I love when people teach on them and I like to reread them. And then I'm not so familiar with other passages. So what Nehemiah does is he steps back and he says, God, I remember the entirety of your word to us. You said that if we mess up and we reject you and we move away from you, well, you'll let this happen. And it happened. But you also said that if we come back to you, you will help us make things right. So Nehemiah starts to internalize that and remember that it's not just about this, There's this teaching going on too. There's this holistic approach to our faith. God's involved in every bit of it. So it's like he's not holding God accountable. He's holding himself accountable, internalizing the bigger picture. That's beautiful, isn't it? And then Nehemiah goes on, and this is where Nehemiah and David Green kind of invert things. And I want to be more like Nehemiah. It's then that Nehemiah asks. Usually David Green goes straight to the punch. God, you got to do something. God, you got to make this right. God, help. But Nehemiah sets a better example. Let me make things right in here. Let me really assess what I should be focusing on, where God may be at work in this. And then let me ask him things according to his will and his ways. Is that phenomenal or what? I love the quote that says, the function of prayer, it's not to influence God. And I bet if you're honest, and I'll be honest with you to set the example, that's a lot of times, that's my point of prayer. And if I pray more, or have you ever heard this? If I pray harder. Like, what does that even mean? You know, it's like, Urgh! You know, you squint and you grunt or something like that. How do you pray harder? But if you pray a certain way, then you're going to move God to move. You're going to influence him. No, that's not the purpose of prayer. It's not to influence God, but rather to change the heart of the one praying, so that our confidence isn't necessarily in what we want to happen, but in his will, his ways. That's what Nehemiah is sorting out. Isn't that beautiful? I love that dynamic. And here's why it's important, and here's why it's probably going to get really practical for you and me. So Nehemiah probably doesn't realize this, especially when for some time he's mourning and fasting and praying, and not in that praying way to where he's learning how to change his heart instead of influencing God. But I bet he's sorting this out, and I bet he doesn't even realize how God is going to help him in this moment, or what God is going to do in response to his prayer. But you go into chapter 2, and Nehemiah steps into his position as cupbearer to the king. And it's at a time, there's some weird language in there for us about dates and times, but I want you to notice the king in particular. King Artaxerxes. Don't lose sight of that name, okay? King Artaxerxes. So Nehemiah was apparently a stellar employee. If you were a cupbearer, you had to hide your emotions when you came into the presence of the king. So Nehemiah was probably a stellar employee, never letting his emotions show until this one particular day, and the king notices it. It's like, I've never seen you so upset or sad. Something's off. I can see it in your eyes, Nehemiah. What's going on? I love the next verse. Nehemiah says, I was scared to death. I was very much afraid. Do you see what's going on here? I don't think Nehemiah is scared because he's in the presence of the king. I don't think Nehemiah is scared because of this particular setup. I don't think that he's worried about losing his job if he says the wrong thing. I think he's worried about who this particular person is. And if we wrap our minds around this, it could really shape our prayer life. This is a moment where Nehemiah has been asking for something. And I don't think he gets it up until this moment where he's face to face with this king, that he realizes God's answering his prayer. And he's actually using some very uncomfortable situations for Nehemiah to answer his prayer. So in this moment, Nehemiah is scared. He's afraid. And what we're going to see is that prayer, it puts you and me in a position to fight fear. This king, Artaxerxes, you can read about him in a book just before Nehemiah in the Old Testament called Ezra. And notice what you read about him in chapter 4. This same king, there was a rebuilding effort some time ago. There was a rebuilding effort where some people were going to get together and rebuild the wall. And this king stopped it. And he stopped it by force. And now Nehemiah's prayer has been, hey, we got to make this right, God. This is your people. This is your city. The walls laid bare. This can't be, not just for the people, but for you and your glory and your honor. We've got to rebuild it. And now Nehemiah is face to face with the same guy who stopped that once upon a time. When you start praying these risky prayers, and it's not just reactionary, but you're really considering it, God, I've messed up. Let's make things right here. And your word says this, and I want to go all in on your word. And we start internalizing that like Nehemiah. And then you frame your ask up based on his ways. Then he starts to really answer and respond to those prayers. And maybe in some ways that puts you and me in situations that scare us. And we're frightened. And we're afraid. We're uncomfortable. I don't want to be in this scenario, so I'm asking God to take it away or change it, when really he wants me in that moment. And he wants me in that moment. He wants to use me to help move the ball down the field. You ever been there? And some of you are probably in your mind right now playing out scenarios or working through some relationship. When you leave here and you drive off this property, you're going to drive into something else that you really don't want to be a part of. But you know what? If your prayer was, God, what's your angle on this? You may realize that you're the one he wants to be a part of that problem, because he's going to use you regardless of how you feel about it. Prayer positions us to fight fear. When you read the word fear or afraid in your Bible, the underlying connotation is, or kind of the denotation, the deep drive of this word means to avoid or withdraw. And you think about that. Those situations that you and we want to avoid, put some distance between, just withdraw from, those may be the very moments God wants us to step into and face head on, regardless of how we feel. It's in those moments that we may realize that God is answering our prayers. This is a beautiful story. You see how he's putting on a clinic. And it's not just about how he feels. He's stepping into this regardless of how he feels. This is awesome. So the king looks at him. You know, he's afraid. And he was like, well, Nehemiah steps into the moment and he's like, well, you know where I'm from, the city, my ancestors, my people. There's been a big problem, and it's bothering me. And what happens next is amazing. And I bet Nehemiah didn't see it coming, but the king locks eyes with this guy and says, what do you want? Put yourself in that situation. You're Nehemiah. Do you think, wait, is this a setup? A blank check, an open door, a trap? Regardless of whatever it is, this question from the king is part of the answered prayer. Nehemiah's been praying for God to move. Here we go. Isn't this amazing? So there could be so much here. Just let me draw two quick connections with this. If you're in any position, and it doesn't have to be in business, it doesn't have to be solely in education, it can be in family, or it can be in management or whatever. This is a beautiful concept. Later on in 2024, we're going to be talking about self-leadership. But suffice it now to say, you and me, you're the hardest person you will ever lead. But there will be times where just because of who you are, you've got some influence. You've got some influence laterally, and you've got some influence down. You're over some people. There will be times in your life, though, where there's someone above you, and you've got to lead them. And it requires a totally different skill set to lead this way, and then this way. And that's where Nehemiah is, and it's beautiful what he does. So I tell my children all the time, I'm like, hey, if something's really important to you, I get it. I know what it's like to be a kid. You don't realize this, but I was a kid once. You don't realize this, but I was a teenager once. I went to high school, experienced all this stuff that you experience and everything. So I tell my children, if something's really, really, really important to you, you need to let me know. There's 5 people in the home. We're going in 5 different directions. We may not be on the same page at times. So if you ask for something and I'm like, no, that's not a good time or whatever, and we just move on. If something is really, really, really important to you, you've got to let me know so I can move some funds around. move the schedule around. And if it's really important to you, I want to make it happen. So Sophie has become a rock star with this leading up dynamic. And she's kind of like Nehemiah. She's always wants to be stellar, if you will. So side note, one of the things I try to do with the kids too is to create a kind of a balanced rhythm for us. As I'm like, hey, anything that you're responsible for, knock that out before you ask for anything. So I get these texts all the time saying, hey, I'm done with all this stuff. Can I? And I'm like, that works so well. And it moves me. So they're learning that language and it moves me. But I get this text from Sophie not so long ago. And it's so well done that I had to be like, okay, I don't want to really put the money out for that. But this is pretty good leading up kind of stuff. So I've told the girls, Christian, I don't know how I do this long term, but I've told the girls based on, if they get married and they do the whole name change and all that, I've told the girls for years that, hey, as long as your last name is Green, you'll always have access to money, okay? I've always just building into my girls that father-daughter relationship and all that going on. So I get this text from Sophie and it says, hey, and I know that if he wants something, straight to the punch. If it's Sophie or Bella, it's, hey, and then I know a request is going to come. So it's like, hey, taking care of everything and all that, but I've got a problem. I don't have a dress, and I need a blue dress, but I don't have one. Solution: this particular store has one. They have my size. It's the one I want. All right, okay, keep reading. Problem: the skirt is X amount of dollars. Or dress is X amount of dollars, so it's pretty expensive. I won't tell you how much. Solution: my last name is Green. So I'm covered. Is that awesome or what? Okay. So when Nehemiah says, the king's like, hey, what do you want? And Nehemiah says, the city. Isn't that beautiful? He doesn't say which city. He says, the city where I'm from, because you're the same king that stopped this X amount of time ago, so I know I need to approach this a certain way. I don't think that just happens. I think that happens from someone who has, for some time, mourned and fasted and prayed and sorted through some stuff, and then presented themselves to their God, and some time has elapsed, and they've matured and they've grown with this idea of prayer. They've grown with this dynamic that it's not just what I want or feel in the moment, but what He wants from me. So that's a guy who can say, this king who said no a while back by force, I'm face to face with him, and he's asking me what I want. Can I really go all in with this? Well, once you've sorted through this prayer dynamic like Nehemiah, yeah, you can. And you can tell the guy what you want. That's awesome. And it's the answer to the prayer as well. The prayer that Nehemiah's been praying, and he's part of the solution. Just like some of these details that make you afraid of what's going on in your life, you're part of the solution as well. So the story goes on. The king's like, well, how long will this take? You're my go-to cupbearer. You're my favorite. You're my star employee. How long will this take? And here's another question. So the first question, what do you want? And now how long is it going to take? This is awesome. And this is Nehemiah stepping into both of these questions in real time because of what he's been doing over time. So you may be tempted this morning or later on today to just echo one of those prayers. God, move. But it may not be the right time. There's not that moment where you need to influence God. But that prayer you're going to be praying later on is to help change your heart to align with His ways. So Nehemiah, well, he does this thing, and I bet you don't know this. Look, yeah, There's a handful of you. I've done this with you. And not just with you, I've probably done this 1,000 times. Nehemiah prays. He prays. But it's not one of those prayers of mourning and fasting. It's, God, I'm in this moment and I know this is your doing. I know this is your setup. I know you're at work here. So help me keep rolling with this. Help me to get this right. I've been in so many conversations where I'm listening on the other side of the table what's going on, and I'm getting all the details, and in my mind I'm like, God, I'm a little blank on this one. But I'm here, and I know you want me here. So help me in this moment. And that's what Nehemiah does. He prays, and he's like, hey, I want to go help, and I'm going to be gone for a while. And the king Artaxerxes is like, how long? And he's like, well, I don't know, but I'm going to set a time. Is that awesome? So he sets this time up. I think this is what the Ecclesiastes author meant. If you've got this book in Ecclesiastes in the Old Testament, it's just a phenomenal book to read through. So practical, really theoretical at the beginning, but practical too. It's just a great book. But the author notes, he says, the wise in heart. And I think, again, prayer produces that wisdom that we need to understand the will and the ways of God. But the wise in heart will know the right time and the right procedure. The wise in heart will know what to do and when to do it. And that's where Nehemiah is. Now, I think it was John Maxwell, and I know John Maxwell, he's not controversial at all, but in leadership circles, it depends on what camp you're in. Some people love John Maxwell, some people do not like John Maxwell at all, but I think it was John Maxwell, so if you don't like him, forgive the reference or the name drop, but I think it was John Maxwell who popularized this, but I think it's so accurate, and I think it's accurate for Nehemiah and what's going on in his life. I think it's accurate and reflective of prayer, and I think it's accurate with the things that we ask God for in prayer. And I bet it's so accurate for your life in some regard right now in real time. But this idea of the wise in heart knowing the right time and the right way, John Maxwell frames it up like this. He says, hey, you've got time and you've got action. And if you've got the wrong of both, if it's the wrong action and the wrong time, it's going to be disastrous. And that's why we pray. And some scholars suggest that from the moment Nehemiah in chapter 1 heard that the walls were still laying low, from that moment to the moment he stood in front of King Artaxerxes, and King Artaxerxes said, what do you want? Was about 4 months. I don't know about you, but it's easy for David Green to rush some stuff. So if you've got the wrong action and the wrong time, it's going to be a disaster. You got the wrong action and the right time, you're looking at a mistake. Kind of like Michelle and I are going to be celebrating 22 years of marriage next month. And just in a little bit, I can't believe we've been married 22 years. Man, it's just flown by. And she's downstairs right now. So just put it out there. I'm thinking maybe jewelry and a weekend getaway. Or the new Swiffer wet jet. All right? I mean, they've upgraded the model. It's looking good. She's downstairs. The door's open. I hope she doesn't hear. I'm leaning toward the Swiffer. Don't let that out. But I'm thinking about the anniversary, right time, wrong action, right? Mistake. And you don't want to make a mistake. And then you've got the right action at the wrong time, resistance. And this is really on my radar, because we're rolling here at Madison Hills, and it's phenomenal. Things are going great. And there's some moves that maybe we want to make, or some of us want to make, or maybe moves that I want to make. And we got to pray this up because we want to do it, and maybe it's the right thing. But if we do it at the wrong time, some of us are going to be like, I don't know about that, right? But then if you've got the right action at the right time, it's success. And I see that working out in Nehemiah's life, sorting through this stuff. And if it was a 4-month elapse, what's really interesting about that is that this was a big decision, and he felt it. He was mourning and fasting and crying out to God. He felt it every stinking day of those 4 months. But he didn't rush a decision. That's important. And I think sometimes in my prayer life, I try to rush it with God. So in our prayers, we want to slow down and align ourselves with His ways to get His take on this and allow Him to do His good work. So you read this and the story ends, and Nehemiah in his own words says, and I bet if you could read his journal, what an interesting story it would be. But he sums this first part up and he says, the king answered my request. He gave me the funds to make this happen. He rearranged the schedule, and he sent me off, ready for success, because the gracious hand of my God was on me. Why was it on him? Well, for some time, he wrestled with this. And he sorted some stuff out, and he got clear in his heart and his mind. Then he said, God, this is more about you than me. What do you want in this situation? And that's where you and I are this morning. And whatever you're about to walk back into once you walk out of these doors. And maybe it's got you shook, and you're afraid. And the thing you want more than anything is to just avoid it. Well, I beg you to reconsider this morning and ask God, wait, I'm trying to get away from this. I'm trying to get out of this. Is this actually something you want me to step into? You want to use me to make the most out of this? And I guarantee you the answer is probably more yes than no. Father, you are so good. We thank you for your word that reveals just how good you are. And sometimes we don't understand it, or we lose sight of it. We forget about it because of the emotion we're feeling in the moment. And we get convinced that it's whatever we want, we have because we've simply asked you for it. And then we have some unanswered prayers, and some time goes on and things haven't changed, and we're left asking, why? When really the responsibility that we have is to make sure we're sorting things out according to your will, your ways, and making your will and your ways our will and our ways. That's our confidence in approaching you. So I pray, Father, that maybe for some of us, this is affirming, and for some of us, it's a new take on prayer and a new day for us at Madison Hills, and how Madison Hills prays to you, and how we devote ourselves to prayer, and how we allow you to work in our hearts and minds, not so that we're influencing you, so that you're changing our hearts. You're influencing us. Help us to take some of the stuff that Nehemiah did home with us and begin using it now, and watch you work and watch you move in the ways that you want. God, again, you're good. We know that most clearly through your Son, Jesus. So as always, we use his name to pray and praise you. Amen.